On a Thursday morning in September of 1987, the Dempster Industries manufacturing plant in Beatrice, Nebraska, closed its doors without warning and left 412 people without jobs and an entire region without the only source of replacement parts for 30 years of agricultural and rural equipment that was still in active use across 6 states. The closure was announced on a Wednesday afternoon via a single-page memo distributed to shift supervisors. By Thursday morning, the parking lot was empty, and the loading dock doors were padlocked, and a man named Gerald Purcell, who had run the parts counter at Dempster for 22 years and knew the catalog by memory the way a librarian knows a collection, was standing in that parking lot with his hands in his pockets, trying to decide what to do next. Gerald would figure it out, because Gerald always figured things out. But that is not the story this is. Let me tell you instead about what the closure meant to the farms and the rural water systems and the small-town machine shops within 150 miles of Beatrice, because what it meant was this. Every windmill, every pump jack, every well cylinder, every gear assembly that carried the Dempster name, and there were thousands of them, on farms and ranches and rural homesteads from the Nebraska sandhills to the Kansas Flint Hills, had just been orphaned. The factory that made the parts that kept them running was gone. The catalog that listed those parts still existed. The parts themselves had ceased to be manufactured. What remained in the field was what remained, and what remained would eventually wear out. And when it did, there would be nowhere to go. Most people understood this as a slow-moving problem, a 10-year problem, maybe a 20-year problem for equipment that was already old. Cleat Mossman had understood it as a problem 30 years before it became one. Let me tell you about Cleat Mossman because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his shop contained and why it contained it. Cleat was 61 years old in 1987 and had run a one-man machine shop and repair operation out of a converted implement barn on his property, 11 miles southeast of Hastings, Nebraska, since 1958, the year he came back from his second tour in Korea, and decided he was done going anywhere that wasn't within driving distance of the Republican River Valley. His father, August Mossman, had homesteaded the original ground in 1912 and had drilled the first water well on the property in 1914, using a Dempster rig that August had driven out from the dealer in Grand Island on a wagon. That well had run a Dempster windmill that was still standing in 1987, still pumping, still moving water to the stock tank on the south side of the property. Its galvanized tail vane faded and its wooden wheel replaced twice, but its mechanism, the gearbox, the brake assembly, the connecting rod and sucker rod and cylinder below, original to 1914 and maintained by August, and then by Cleat with the kind of attention that people pay to things they understand to be irreplaceable. Cleat had grown up watching his father maintain that windmill. He had been 12 years old the first time August took him up the tower to show him the gearbox, and what August had shown him was not just how the gearbox worked, but how to think about what it did. The relationship between the vane catching wind and the wheel turning, and the eccentric converting rotation to linear movement, and the connecting rod transmitting that movement 60 feet underground to the cylinder that pushed water up. August Mossman believed that a man who understood a system completely could maintain it indefinitely. He believed that the only thing that made equipment obsolete was the failure of understanding, not the failure of the equipment itself. Cleat had inherited this belief with the same totality he had inherited the land. He had begun accumulating Dempster components in 1955, 3 years before he opened the shop, for reasons that he would later describe as practical rather than prophetic. He had been repairing rural equipment in the area informally since returning from Korea, and had noticed that the most common failure point in Dempster windmill systems was not the visible mechanism above ground, but the cylinder assembly below. Specifically the leathers, the standing valves, the working valves, and the sand pumps that kept the cylinder clear of sediment intrusion. These components failed regularly. They were consumable, and the dealer network, even at its peak functionality, operated on restocking cycles that left rural operators waiting 2 to 4 weeks for parts that were needed immediately, because a dry well in summer in south-central Nebraska was not a 2 to 4 week problem. Cleat started buying extras. He bought 2 when he needed 1. He bought case quantities when dealers were clearing old stock. And he bought components off retired windmills he was called to remove, disassembling them carefully before scrapping the tower, sorting every serviceable part into the labeled bins he built along the north wall of the shop from pine lumber and hardware store angle iron. He bought complete pump cylinders from estate sales and auctions when farms changed hands and the new owners wanted the old equipment gone. He bought entire gearbox assemblies from dealers who couldn't move them. He bought parts he didn't currently need because he had learned from his father that need and emergency were not the same thing, and that a man who waited until he needed something to acquire it would spend his life in a condition of controlled desperation. By 1987, when the Dempster plant closed, Cleat Mossman's shop contained what was almost certainly the largest private inventory of Dempster windmill components in the state of Nebraska. He had, by his own count, made in a notebook he kept for that purpose, sufficient cylinder leathers to service approximately 300 windmill cylinders. He had gearbox components, pinion gears, bull gears, eccentric straps, crank pins, for every model Dempster had manufactured between 1920 and 1975. He had complete cylinder assemblies in 6 standard sizes. He had brake assemblies, vane hardware, wheel hub castings, connecting rod ends, and a full wall of steel sucker rod sections in the standard 5/8 and 3/4 inch diameters. He had wooden wheel spokes, milled to the original dimensions from white oak, because he had been making his own when the factory supply ran thin since approximately 1972. He had not advertised any of this. He was not operating a parts business. He was operating a repair shop, and the parts were what enabled the repairs, and the repairs were what kept the equipment in the ground functioning. The neighbors had been bringing him their broken equipment for almost 30 years. They had not always been gracious about it. Let me tell you about the shop's reputation before 1987, because it is necessary context for what happened after. Rural equipment repair is a community that carries its social textures openly. A man who fixes things well is respected. A man who also keeps parts that nobody else has is both useful and, to a certain kind of mind, eccentric in a way that invites ribbing. The ribbon that Cleat Mossman absorbed over the years fell into a pattern that anyone who has spent time in small agricultural communities would recognize. It was the kind of ribbon that covered admiration with irony, that said, "You're a pack rat," while meaning, "We're glad you exist, but we're not going to say so directly because saying so directly would make us seem soft." Harold Fenstermaker, who ran 800 acres 2 townships east and had been bringing his broken pump cylinders to Cleat since 1961, was the primary author of this ribbing. Harold was not a cruel man. He was a man who expressed himself through teasing the way some men express themselves through silence, and Cleat had known Harold since they were in the same class at the county school, and understood him accordingly. Harold's standard routine: which he had performed variations of for 25 years, involved arriving at the shop with a broken component, watching Cleat walk directly to a bin and produce the exact replacement, and then saying some version of what Harold had been saying since approximately 1965, that Cleat's shop was a monument to refusing to throw anything away, that the fire marshal was going to condemn the building if he kept filling it up, that the county ought to charge property tax on the pile of junk he was accumulating and use the revenue to fix the roads, and so forth. He always said these things with a grin. He always left with his part. He never paid more than cost. Cleat had heard versions of this speech so many times that he had stopped registering it as commentary, and he registered it the way he registered wind noise in the shop eaves, as background, as weather, as a condition of the environment, rather than a message requiring response. There were others with similar opinions, expressed with varying degrees of warmth. Ed Camrath, who ran the small engine shop in Hastings, had told Cleat more than once that he was going to spend his retirement sorting through the barn and throwing out 40 years of accumulated nothing, and that he had better start soon because at the rate he was going, it would take longer than he had. Darrell Voss, who farmed west of town and had grown up watching his own father treat equipment as disposable and replacement as the natural answer to every mechanical problem, thought Cleat's habit of salvaging components from retired machines was admirable in theory and impractical in reality, because parts that had been in service long enough to be retired had been in service long enough to be unreliable, and you were better off with new stock from the factory. Darrell expressed this opinion in September of 1987, 3 weeks after the Dempster plant closed, when he came to Cleat's shop needing a replacement eccentric strap for the gearbox on his 1952 Dempster 14-foot windmill. He needed it because the original had cracked along the casting seam, a failure mode Cleat had seen 40 times and diagnosed by sound before Darrell had finished describing the problem. He needed it because the Dempster catalog listed the part at a price that was now purely theoretical, because the factory that manufactured it no longer existed. He needed it because the 3 other sources he had called, 2 dealers in Nebraska and 1 in Kansas, had none in stock and no expectation of ever having any, because the factory that manufactured it no longer existed. He arrived at the shop on a Tuesday morning with the cracked strap in a paper bag and an expression that Cleat would describe to his wife, Lorraine, that evening as the look of a man who has eaten something disagreeable and is not yet willing to admit it. Darrell explained the situation. He said he knew Cleat had a lot of old parts. He said he wasn't sure if any of it would be what he needed. He said he'd called everyone he could think of and come up empty. Cleat said, "What year and what head size?" Darrell told him. And Cleat walked to the east wall of the secondary room. He consulted his notebook briefly, then went to a bin on the 3rd shelf marked D-14-gear-eccentric-1940-1965 in black paint stencil. He removed a heavy paper bag, unfolded the top, looked at the contents, and handed it to Darrell. Darrell opened the bag. Inside was a cast-iron eccentric strap, identical to the one he'd brought in the paper bag, uncracked, lightly oiled, with a paper tag in Cleat's handwriting that read Dempster 14 feet, eccentric strap, pulled from retired unit 1973, inspected clean. Darrell was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've had this for 14 years. Cleat said, 15. He said the machine it came from was retired in 72, not 73. He'd misnumbered the tag. Darrell said, "How many of these do you have?" Cleat said, 4 more of that casting and 7 of the later casting that fits 58 and newer. He said, the later casting runs a slightly smaller bore on the pin end. They're not interchangeable. He pulled out the notebook and showed Darrell the entry. Darrell looked at the notebook. He looked at the bin. He looked at the east wall, where the stenciled bins ran from floor to ceiling across 22 feet of shelving. He looked at the west wall, which was the same. He said, "Cleat, what have you got in here?" Cleat said, "About 30 years of things that were going to be needed eventually." He said it without emphasis, the way a man states something that seems obvious to him. "Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a person arrive at a place of understanding that rearranged their entire assessment of something they thought they knew? Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that comes with argument and confrontation. The quiet kind, where a man stands in a room and looks at the shelves and something settles in behind his eyes like a weight finding its position. That is what happened to Darrell Voss in Cleat Mossman's secondary room on a Tuesday morning in October of 1987. He did not apologize exactly, but he did stand there for a long time without saying anything that could be mistaken for criticism. He paid for the eccentric strap. He said he'd be back. He was. Let me tell you about the decade that followed the closure because it is where the inventory revealed its full meaning. Between 1987 and 1997, Cleat Mossman repaired or supplied parts for 419 Dempster windmill and pump systems across 8 counties. This number comes from his job log, which he kept with the same regularity as his parts inventory. A spiral notebook per year, 1 line per job, date and customer and equipment description and parts used and hours charged. The notebooks are on a shelf in the shop. Carl Mossman, Cleat's son, can show them to you. The jobs ranged from simple leather replacements, consumable maintenance that would previously have required a dealer order and a 2-week wait, to complete pump cylinder rebuilds, gearbox overhauls, and 1 restoration of a 1924 Dempster annu-oiled windmill that a family in Furnace County had inherited with their land and wanted to return to service. Yeah, the restoration took Cleat 11 days and used components from 4 different bins, including a set of wooden wheel spokes he turned from white oak on the lathe in the main bay and fitted to the original cast-iron hub with a precision that the Furnace County family described when they came to pick up the machine as indistinguishable from factory original. Harold Fenstermaker came in the spring of 1988 with a cracked bull gear from his No. 2 windmill and a demeanor that was quieter than usual. He handed Cleat the gear. Cleat looked at the crack. Clean through the web between 2 of the cast-iron teeth, the kind of failure that usually indicated a hard freeze event, and walked to the bin. He came back with a bull gear. Harold looked at it. He looked at the bin Cleat had opened. He said, "How long have you had that?" Cleat checked the tag. He said, "Since '69. Harold said, "I've been giving you a hard time since '65 about keeping all this stuff." Cleat said, "I know." Harold said, "And the whole time you had this sitting there." Cleat said, "I had it sitting there." Harold was quiet. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." Cleat said, "You owe me $12 for the gear." He said it without a smile, but also without coldness, the way a man declines a debt he doesn't need collected. Harold laughed. He paid the $12. He did not give Cleat a hard time about keeping things after that. He did, however, tell the story at the elevator and at the co-op and at the implement dealer's coffee counter, and the story spread the way useful information spreads in small agricultural communities. through repetition and embellishment until the numbers were somewhat enlarged, but the essential truth was intact. Ed Camrath, the small engine man from Hastings, came in November of 1988 with a cast-iron pump cylinder he could not match anywhere in his supplier network, needing a new standing valve seat. He did not introduce the visit with any commentary about Cleat's storage habits. He described what he needed. Cleat found it. Ed said, "What do you charge for consultation?" Cleat said, "What do you mean?" Ed said, "I mean, when someone calls me and I don't have a part, I want to be able to tell them to call you. Do you have a rate for that?" Cleat said he didn't have a rate for anything except parts at cost and labor at $30 an hour, and that Ed was welcome to send anyone who called with a Dempster problem. Ed sent people. Over the following decade, Ed sent Cleat an estimated 40 customers who came through his referral network. Ed considered this a fair trade for the standing valve seat, which he'd been unable to find anywhere else, and without which a family's rural water supply in Nuckolls County would have gone dry in November. Let me tell you about Cleat's relationship with the machine that anchored everything, because every shop that contains this kind of knowledge has an object at its center that is more than an object. The 1914 Dempster Windmill on the Mossman property north of the house was still running in 1987. It was still running in 1997. It was still running when Cleat Mossman died in February of 2001 at the age of 74, yet of the same kind of slow heart failure that had taken his father August at 69, which Cleat had often said was the one Mossman inheritance he'd have preferred to skip. Cleat had maintained that windmill himself for 43 years after August died. He had replaced the leathers on a 4-year cycle. He had replaced the wooden wheel spokes twice, milling them himself from white oak. He had replaced the connecting rod end bearing in 1966 when it began to develop lateral play, and in doing so had discovered that the original bearing material was a bronze alloy that was no longer standard, and had machined a replacement from bronze bar stock on the lathe and kept the leftover bar stock and the machining specs in the notebook he'd started for the windmill specifically, which, by the time he died, ran to 61 pages of maintenance records and dimensional notes and observations about performance under different wind conditions and load states. He had never replaced the gearbox. He had adjusted the bull gear mesh twice, had replaced the crank pin once in 1978, and had rebuilt the eccentric strap in 1984, using a casting from the bin on the east wall. The gearbox that August Mossman had installed on that tower in 1914 was the same gearbox that pumped water to the stock tank in the winter of 2000, the last winter of Cleat's life. At the funeral, Harold Fenstermaker told Carl Mossman that his father was the most useful man in 4 counties, and that he had not said so enough times while saying so had still been possible. When he said it in the parking lot of the Lutheran Church in Hastings with his hat in his hands and the specific quality of grief that men carry for people they've known so long that the loss rearranges the geography of their daily life. Carl thanked him. Carl was 42 and had worked in the shop beside Cleat since he was old enough to reach a workbench, and he knew the inventory as well as his father had because Cleat had walked him through every bin the same way Virgil Bauer would walk Carl through the secondary room a decade later in a story being told in a county to the east. Not because either man had planned it as a teaching moment, but because that was how knowledge moved between generations in shops like these, through proximity and repetition and the patient demonstration of method. Carl kept the shop. Shuey kept the inventory system. He extended it, as Carl Bauer would extend his father's system. not as a replacement, but as an amplification, adding a cross-reference binder that linked Dempster part numbers to the dimensional specifications Cleat had recorded, so that when a part could not be identified by catalog number alone, it could be identified by what it measured and what it was meant to do. He also kept the windmill running. Let me tell you about the call that came in March of 2009, because it is where the shop found its second generation of meaning. A woman named Patricia Hollenbeck called the shop from a ranch in Cherry County, in the Nebraska Sandhills, 312 miles from Hastings. She had gotten Carl's number from a man in Ord, who had gotten it from a man in Broken Bow, who had gotten it from Ed Comrath's son, who had taken over his father's small engine shop and maintained his father's habit of knowing who to call when he didn't have an answer. Patricia had a 1941 Dempster Model 12 windmill that had been on the ranch since her grandfather bought it new, and that had developed a failure in the pump cylinder below ground, a failure that had been diagnosed as a cracked cylinder barrel by a well service company out of Valentine that had pulled the drop pipe and looked. The well service company had told her that the cylinder would need to be replaced and that they had no source for a replacement, and that she should consider converting the system to a submersible electric pump. Patricia said the ranch had no power line within 2 miles. She said the ranch ran on solar and wind and gravity and had since her grandfather built it, and that her grandfather's position on grid dependence had not changed with his death, and she intended to honor it. She said she needed a cylinder barrel for a Dempster Model 12, 2-inch bore, and she understood if nobody had one. Carl went to the secondary room. He found, on the bottom shelf of the west wall, a wooden crate labeled Dempster 12, cylinder barrel, 2-inch bore, pulled 1969, unused. The crate had been there since 1969. Cleat had pulled it off a retired machine at an auction in Clay County because the cylinder barrel was unscratched, and he had thought at the time that a 2-inch bore was a size he should have on hand because the Model 12 had sold well in Sandhills country where the water table ran deep and a smaller bore reduced the lifting load on lighter wind. He had been right about that 38 years before anyone called to confirm it. Carl shipped the cylinder barrel to Cherry County on a Friday. Patricia Hollenbeck had her windmill running by the following Wednesday, pumping water to stock tanks on a ranch that had never been connected to the electric grid and did not intend to start. She sent Carl a check for the part and a note that said her grandfather had believed that things built to last would last if you treated them accordingly, and that she was glad there were still people who understood what that meant in practice. Carl kept the note. It is on the wall above the workbench where Cleat's notes used to be, in a different handwriting but making the same point. The windmill on the Mossman property north of the house is still running. Carl maintains it on the same 4-year leather cycle his father used. His daughter, Miriam, who's 19 years old and studying agricultural engineering at the University of Nebraska, and comes home on breaks and goes straight to the shop, the way Carl went straight to the shop when he was her age, has been shown the maintenance notebook, all 61 pages of Cleat's observations and Carl's additions, now running to 94 pages, and has begun making entries of her own. Her handwriting is smaller than Carl's, which is smaller than Cleat's, so the pages are denser now, but the information is the same kind of information. What was done, when, what was found, what was replaced, what the system sounded like before and after. The bins on the east and west walls of the secondary room are still labeled in Cleat's paint stencil, though some of the labels have faded enough that Carl has traced over them in black marker. The cross-reference binder runs to 3 volumes. The job log continues in spiral notebooks, one per year, one line per job, date and customer and equipment and parts and hours. The same format Cleat established in 1958 and never saw any reason to change. Harold Fenstermaker's grandson called the shop in the summer of 2022 with a gearbox question about a mill on the family's property that Harold had bought in 1959 and that 3 generations of Fenstermakers had maintained since. Carl answered the question. He found the relevant entry in the cross-reference binder. Cleat's original entry, written in 1961, about the specific casting variation in the 1958 and later gearbox that distinguished it from the earlier design. Carl read it to the young man over the phone, and the young man said that was exactly what he needed to know. Carl did not mention that the information had been written down 61 years earlier by a man who had understood, in 1961, that it would eventually be needed by someone who had not yet been born. He did not mention it because it did not seem like the kind of thing that required mentioning. It seemed like the natural result of paying attention, which was what August Mossman had taught Cleat, and what Cleat had taught Carl, and what Carl was teaching Miriam, and what the shop had always been for. Not storage exactly, but memory. The difference between storage and memory is that storage holds things until you need them. Memory holds things because letting go of them would mean letting go of the understanding that produced them. And understanding, once lost, does not restock itself from a catalog. The Dempster plant site in Beatrice is a distribution warehouse now. The loading dock doors are the same, but the padlock is different. Gerald Purcell, who ran the parts counter for 22 years and knew the catalog by memory, passed away in 2015. His copy of the catalog, annotated in his handwriting with cross-references and supersession notes he'd developed over 2 decades, is in Carl Mossman's shop, on the shelf above the cross-reference binder, because Gerald had heard about the shop through Ed Cumrath's son and had driven down to see it in 2003, and had stood in the secondary room for a long time without saying anything, and then had asked Carl if he thought the catalog would be useful there. Carl had said yes. Gerald had said good. He'd said he'd been worried about where it should go. Miriam Mossman will graduate in the spring. She has been offered a position with an agricultural engineering firm in Lincoln that does rural water system assessment across the Central Plains. She has not decided whether to take it. She's thinking about the shop the way people think about things they were raised inside of, with the particular combination of clarity and obligation that comes from understanding something's value before being asked to choose whether to carry it forward. The 1914 Windmill is pumping this morning. The wind, off the Republican River Valley, is running steady from the northwest at 11 miles per hour, which Cleat's notebook identifies as the threshold at which the wheel achieves rated stroke frequency and the cylinder delivers full daily output to the tank. The notation is from 1971. It is still accurate. It will still be accurate when Miriam's children are old enough to climb the tower and be shown the gearbox and asked, the way August asked Cleat, and Cleat asked Carl, and Carl asked Miriam what the machine is trying to do and what would prevent it from doing. That's what happens when you underestimate something that was built to